Fellas, who is the greatest featherweight of all time? I think this is by far the most interesting GOAT debate in the UFC because you have 3 or 4 legit candidates, and that's unlike any other weight class we have in MMA. Jose Aldo, Conor McGregor, Max Holloway, Alexander Volkanovski. These are 4 guys who are all in the top 15 to 20 greatest fighters in UFC history, and the fact that they're all in the same weight class is just nuts. If you took a random sample of MMA fans and asked them who the greatest of all time in the featherweight division was, you would have fans answering for all 4 of those different fighters, and I just find that fascinating. I mean, just think about the other GOAT debates in the other weight classes. 125, it's pretty clearly Demetrius Johnson. 135, there's some conversation, but most people will say it's Dominic Cruz. 155, it's probably Khabib, maybe Islam. 170, it's clearly GSP. 185, it's clearly Anderson Silva. 205, clearly John Jones. And 265, you have a conversation for a lot of guys, but it's pretty much between Stipe and Fedor. Then you have the anomaly, which is featherweight, which has 4 different guys competing for that GOAT crown. We're going to go in chronological order and break down each guy's case for the crown, starting with the King of Rio, Jose Aldo. Now, Jose Aldo at first glance is probably the easiest pick for the featherweight GOAT. I'd also say he's probably the most popular. I mean, he won 3 belts in WEC and then won the belt 8 times at featherweight in the UFC. This guy's resume is almost untouchable. Just to put into perspective how dominant Jose Aldo was, he went over 10 years from late 2005 to late 2015 without losing a fight at all. Now, obviously, this streak was famously broken by Conor McGregor, which is something we will get to later. Really, from 2010 to 2015, there was a legitimate argument that Jose Aldo was the #1 pound-for-pound best fighter in the entire world. Now, despite probably having the best resume of all 4 guys at a quick glance, there are 2 things that complicate his legacy as a featherweight GOAT. One is a big chunk of his legacy was in WEC and not the UFC, and 2, he lost to all 3 other guys on this list at featherweight. Now, if you didn't know, before 2010, there was no featherweight division in the UFC, meaning some of the best talents in the whole world in fighting were not even in the UFC, including guys like Jose Aldo. And as a result, guys like Jose Aldo were fighting in different organizations like the WEC, where, to be fair, most of the best featherweights in the world were fighting at the time. So obviously the overall competition wasn't as good as it was the UFC when they had that big merger, but I would still consider Jose Aldo the featherweight champion of the world when he was at WEC because those were the best guys in the world and the UFC had yet to have a featherweight division. But now we got to talk about the biggest hit on Jose Aldo's legacy, and it's the fact that he not only lost to Max Holloway, he not only lost to Alexander Volkanovski, he also lost to Conor McGregor. That makes all 3 other GOAT candidates having wins over Jose Aldo. Before you say it, I don't want to hear the argument that he was out of his prime, particularly for the Max Holloway and Conor McGregor fights, because when he fought Max Holloway, he was 31 years old, and when he fought Conor McGregor, he was 29 years old. 29 to 31 should be your absolute peak fighting years. Just because he lost does not mean he was washed at the time. He just ran into the better guys. Now, the Alexander Volkanovski fight, you may have a better argument for because he had lost 3 of his last 6 fights. He was 33, which is a little old, but not too old, especially considering the success he had at later ages. So I would say he was still around his prime, but maybe not at his absolute peak versus Alexander Volkanovski. So the argument stands that Jose Aldo probably does have the best featherweight resume of all time, but he has those 2 big hits on his resume, a part of his legacy being in the WEC, and also the fact that when he fought the 3 other GOAT candidates, he just did not look as good as them. It's tough to argue he's the GOAT when all 3 other guys beat him. Now, next up, we go to Max Holloway, and admittedly, he does have the weakest argument of the 4, but with that being said, he still does have an argument for being the featherweight GOAT. I don't want people to forget that before the Alexander Volkanovski trilogy, a lot of people, including guys like Joe Rogan, were calling Max Holloway the greatest of all time at featherweight, and it was not crazy to say that back then. Max Holloway is one of those guys where if one other man didn't exist, that man being Alexander Volkanovski, there may be an argument for Max Holloway being the GOAT of not only featherweight, but all of MMA. Holloway's another guy that has lost to 2 other guys in the debate. When him and Conor McGregor were both young, Conor McGregor got the better of him. And then we all know about the famous trilogy with Alexander Volkanovski, where Alexander Volkanovski was awarded all 3 wins. But a lot of people scored that second fight with Volkanovski for Max Holloway, including myself. So in my book, he's 1-2 versus Alexander Volkanovski, 0-1 versus Conor McGregor, and arguably most importantly, he's 2-0 against Jose Aldo in title fights. Now, those 2 title fights with Jose Aldo, along with the fact that Max Holloway has 5 featherweight championship wins, are really what's pulling his legacy because a prime Max Holloway and a prime Jose Aldo went against each other. And Max Holloway showed he was just the better fighter, at least in that stylistic matchup. So when people come at me and say that the obvious answer is Jose Aldo, I point to those fights and say, how could you say that Jose Aldo is the GOAT over a guy who was clearly better than him 2 times out of 2? But then an Alexander Volkanovski fan could just as easily say to me, how could you say Holloway's over Volk when Volk beat him 3 times, at least on the judges' scorecards? And that's a fair argument. And that brings us to our next guy, Alexander the Great Volkanovski, who I would say is gaining more and more traction every day, especially a lot of these newer fans are calling him the GOAT over Jose Aldo. I'd say right now it's neck and neck in terms of the most popular pick for the featherweight GOAT between Aldo and Volkanovski. Now, Alexander Volkanovski has 6 featherweight championship wins. That's 1 more than Max Holloway, and obviously combined with the fact that 3 of those were against Max Holloway, his case for the GOAT is extremely strong. Now, he fought Jose Aldo and he beat him, but that was not for a championship belt, and some would argue Aldo wasn't in his prime, but it's definitely still something of note. Now, the argument for Alexander Volkanovski is pretty simple. He has arguably the best resume of all the guys. He faced the best competition. It was all in the UFC, and he looked dominant in nearly all his title wins with the exception of the second one over Max Holloway. Now, if Alexander Volkanovski were able to beat Ilia Topuria, I think it would have been a major consensus that he is the GOAT over Jose Aldo, but he was not able to get that done. And Alexander Volkanovski is kind of old now. I do not see him getting that belt back either, especially considering that I think Ilia Topuria is the best fighter in the world. So you may be asking, if Alexander Volkanovski probably has the best resume and he has wins over 2 of the other guys on the list, why is he not the undisputed GOAT at featherweight? And that's because of the anomaly Conor McGregor. Now, Conor McGregor is by far the hardest one to rank of these 4 guys because he was only at featherweight for 7 fights where he went 7-0, won the interim belt, won the undisputed belt, never defended, never fought again in that weight class. He's truly a unique case at featherweight. Obviously, the argument for Conor McGregor is not resume-based. I mean, he only has 2 championship fight wins, those over Chad Mendes and Jose Aldo. But with that being said, the win over Jose Aldo is arguably the greatest, most impressive UFC win in history. It was against the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the world, and he put him away in 13 seconds. The argument for Conor McGregor is a classic peak over longevity. People say the featherweight Conor McGregor that we saw versus Jose Aldo and Chad Mendes would not lose to any featherweight ever. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that, but the fact is you have to consider resume in these debates. And that brings us to the classic best versus greatest argument, where greatest definitely considers resume, but best is just at that point in time who is the best. It was probably Conor McGregor. Now, obviously, there's a chance that a prime Alexander Volkanovski, a prime Max Holloway, and a Jose Aldo on another night would have been able to beat Conor McGregor. But if I put them all in their prime in the ring at the same time at featherweight, I think I'm putting my money on Conor McGregor. So while he certainly has an argument for being the best just because of his lack of resume, lack of championship wins, I cannot consider him the featherweight GOAT because guys like Volkanovski and Aldo just have way too long of a championship track to be surpassed by Conor McGregor. So that being said, if we're looking at all of our candidates, I think Max Holloway clearly has the worst case of the 4. He lost to 2 of the 3 other guys. His resume is probably 3rd out of 4th, and with that combination, you just cannot call him the GOAT of this division. And the second worst case would probably be for Conor McGregor. He may be the best, but to call him the GOAT, which has the term greatest in it, he just does not have the track record for that. You cannot call him the featherweight GOAT because of his lack of fights at featherweight. So that brings us to Jose Aldo versus Alexander Volkanovski. And honestly, I think this is a matter of personal preference. Their legacies are so similar. Me personally, I'd probably give the nod to Jose Aldo because he did it for a little bit longer. But if you said Alexander Volkanovski, I would not call you crazy. I wouldn't even necessarily disagree with you. So that's my take on the featherweight GOAT conversation. There's definitely a lot of arguments you could give for a lot of different other guys, and that's what makes the conversation so fun. But let me know what you guys agree and disagree with, and thank you for watching.